And it really was. Music was in the soul up there, and it still is.
Crystal Gayle never handed the press anything to work with. No scandals, no meltdowns, no carefully timed controversies. What she gave the world was her voice, and for a long time, the world accepted that as enough. But behind the country music stardom, behind the floor-length hair that became one of the most recognized images in American music history, a private grief was quietly building that her Billboard hits and Grammy nominations could never prepare her for. This is the story of what she carried, what she lost, and what she chose to hold on to when the person who had believed in her first was no longer there. Brenda Gayle Webb came into the world on January 9, 1951, in Paintsville, Kentucky, the youngest of 8 children born to Melvin and Clara Webb. The family had very little money, but music filled every room of that house in a way that money could never buy. Her mother played, her siblings sang. And somewhere inside all that noise, a little girl was listening harder than anyone realized, absorbing the emotional language of song before she had the words to describe what she was doing. Kentucky never left her, not really. No matter how many stages she stood on in Nashville or Europe or across the country music touring circuit, something in her stayed rooted in that small town, and that rootedness became the spine of everything she built. She is the younger sister of Loretta Lynn, the country music icon whose own story is one of the most celebrated in the genre's history. That relationship could have swallowed her whole. It would have been easy, and maybe expected, to spend her career in Loretta's shadow, borrowing from her sister's credibility and riding alongside her legacy. Crystal Gayle refused that path from the beginning. When she first entered the music industry, she signed with the same record label as Loretta and worked with the same management team, and her early material leaned into traditional country sounds. The response was quiet. The records moved without much momentum, and the attention she was hoping for simply didn't arrive. Rather than pushing harder in the same direction, she listened into Loretta's advice, to her own instincts, and to the signals that the industry was sending her. Loretta told her to stop following and start finding. That advice rerouted everything. Working with Nashville producer Alan Reynolds changed the trajectory of her career in ways that are hard to overstate. Reynolds heard something in her voice that earlier producers had missed, a quality that sat between country and pop without fully belonging to either, and that's when the real work began. Together, they built a sound that was warmer than traditional country, more emotionally open at the edges, and yet still honest enough to satisfy listeners who could tell the difference between craft and calculation. Her first real chart breakthrough came in 1975 with Wrong Road Again, and the song did more than perform well. It announced her as a voice worth following on her own terms. The momentum that followed was earned, not inherited. By 1977, everything had shifted permanently. Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue reached #1 on the Billboard Country chart and crossed over to the Billboard Hot 100, landing in the top 5, and none of that captures what actually happened when that song found the world. Radio stations in countries where country music had never built an audience were playing it on rotation. Her voice traveled across languages and cultures and landed somewhere deep and specific in listeners who had never owned a country album in their lives. Crossover success in American music is often described as a lucky accident, but what Crystal Gayle built with Alan Reynolds was deliberate and hard-won. Ready for the Times to Get Better, Talking in Your Sleep, and Half the Way followed in the same period, each of them carrying that same quality. The feeling of a real person singing from somewhere she actually knew. Her 1982 duet with Eddie Rabbitt, You and I, became another major hit, and by that point, she had made herself one of the most versatile crossover artists of her generation in both country and pop. The floor-length hair became inseparable from her public identity the same way the voice did, not because it was engineered as a marketing tool, but because it was simply part of who she was. Every interview circled back to it, every television appearance featured it, and she wore it with the same ease she wore her stage presence, not as performance, but as self. That consistency extended to everything about how she moved through the entertainment world. She didn't manufacture a persona that was bigger or more dramatic than the real thing. Fans and industry people alike noticed it, and that noticeability built a level of trust between her and her audience that decades of changing musical fashions could never fully wear down. Her personal life ran on the same quiet principles. Bill Gatzimos came into her life in the early 1970s, and they married in 1971, building a partnership that the entertainment press had very little to write about because it simply held together without spectacle. He stepped into the role of her manager and worked from behind the scenes for years, handling the business architecture of her career while she focused on the music and the performances. Their daughter, Catherine Claire Gatzimos, arrived in 1983, and their son, Christos James Gatzimos, followed in 1986. Crystal was protective of both children in the specific way that only a parent who understands the cost of public exposure can be. She brought them along on tour when the schedule allowed it, kept their routines in place when it didn't, and worked consistently to give them a life that wasn't defined by their mother's fame. That marriage, that family structure, that commitment to privacy, none of it made headlines, and that was entirely the point. In an industry where long-term marriages are treated as news because they're so rare, theirs survived the peak years of her stardom, the shifting landscape of 1990s country and pop, and the grief that came later. It's still standing today. The 1990s found her using the creative freedom she'd built to explore music that had nothing to do with commercial strategy. Someday, her inspirational album released in 1995 was followed by Sings the Heart and Soul of Hoagie Carmichael in 1999, a collection of American standards that placed her voice in an entirely different tradition. Neither record was chasing the charts she had dominated 2 decades earlier. Both were expressions of genuine artistic curiosity from a woman who had always cared more about the music itself than about what the music could earn her. She also opened a fine art store in Nashville called Crystal's Fine Gifts and Jewelry, a venture that pointed clearly toward her personality, warmth, careful taste, an interest in beauty that extended well beyond the recording studio. The store eventually closed, but while it existed, it offered people a different way to encounter who she actually was. Her industry recognition over the decades told its own story. 1 Grammy Award and multiple Grammy nominations, 5 Academy of Country Music Awards, including the Cliffy Stone Pioneer Award in 2016, 2 Country Music Association Awards, 3 American Music Awards, and a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And then in 2017, induction into the Grand Ole Opry, which stands as one of the highest honors in country music and one that artists of her stature work entire careers to earn. Rolling Stone placed her on its list of the 100 greatest country artists of all time. CMT included her among the 40 greatest women in country music. These weren't given for a single song or a single season. They were given for a body of work built across more than 5 decades, and for a consistency of character that the industry recognized as rare, even by its own standards. October 4th, 2022 arrived and took something from her that no award had prepared her to lose. Loretta Lynn passed away that day, and what Crystal Gayle lost was not simply a famous sister. Loretta was the first person who had looked at her and said she was worth believing in. She was the voice that told her to stop imitating and start discovering. She carried memories of a Kentucky childhood that nobody else in the world could share. The specific sounds of those early years, the feeling of growing up in that crowded house before music was a career and was still just the way the family breathed together. Those close to Crystal said the change in her was visible almost immediately. She became quieter. She pulled further back from public life. Performances continued, but interviews grew fewer, and when she did speak publicly, Loretta's name surfaced often, sometimes directly, sometimes as a pause that went a beat too long before she gathered herself and moved forward. What grief did, besides taking things away, was pull her backward toward her foundation. She began talking more in interviews about her parents, her siblings, her Kentucky roots, reaching into those early memories not out of nostalgia, but out of a need for solid ground when the present had shifted under her feet. Old friendships got more attention. Phone calls went out more often. People who had known her for 20 and 30 years said she seemed to understand more clearly than she ever had that time was not a resource she could take for granted. Loss clarifies things in ways that success never can, and what it clarified for Crystal Gayle was that the music, for all that it had given her, was never what mattered most. What mattered most was the people she loved and the hours she had shared with them. She didn't disappear. She kept performing, kept showing up for the audiences who had followed her since the 1970s, kept standing in front of the crowds who knew every word she'd ever sung. But the way she performed shifted. Her concerts became more personal. She shared stories between songs and let people inside the experience in a way she had kept more guarded before. The professional distance that most performers maintain as a kind of self-protection softened, and what replaced it was something her fans recognized as more real. She was no longer singing to stay famous. She was singing to stay connected to the thing that had held her together since she was a child in Paintsville, listening to her family fill a small house with music. Today she lives quietly, and that suits her completely. Bill is still beside her, their partnership unchanged by the decades that have passed over it. Her children are grown and finding their own way in the world, and she has grandchildren now. And when she talks about them, the controlled composure of a public figure gives way entirely to the unguarded warmth of a grandmother who cannot quite contain what she feels. She chooses her performances carefully now, picking shows that matter rather than filling every available date on a calendar. She records when she wants to, supports charitable causes without announcing it, cooks at home, fills her rooms with photographs and music and the objects that carry memory. Photographs of Loretta are still visible in her home. The grief is still there, folded into the daily rhythm of her life, but it no longer controls the shape of the day. What Crystal Gayle built over more than 50 years in American music and country music is not just a catalog of songs that a generation grew up hearing. It is a way of moving through a life, with discipline, with loyalty, with a clear-eyed understanding that fame passes and family endures. She never let the applause convince her she was something she wasn't, and she never let the grief convince her she was finished. Her story continued long after the charts stopped calling her name, in the mornings with Bill and the phone calls with her children, and the breath she takes before she walks on stage and begins to sing. That is where the real story has always lived, not in the spotlight, but just beyond it, in the place where things are true and the music means something that no award could ever fully measure.